Hey, Rebel Rouser. I'm Alan Voivod, and this is Star Wars 7x7. We're at number 1571 as far as the episode count goes, and today we're talking about a different episode. It would actually be Star Wars Resistance Episode 4, entitled Fuel for the Fire. Now, this is a full spoiler episode, so if you have not watched the show and don't want it spoiled for you, then hey, save this episode for a later date. But if you are cool with me talking about what happened in Fuel for the Fire, even if you are not intending to watch Star Wars Resistance, I'm at least going to catch you up on some things that, as a general fan of Star Wars knowledge, you might like to know. So without further ado, we are going to dive right in and talk about 7 top takeaways from Fuel for the Fire. First of all, let's talk about the plot very briefly. According to the official description that was released prior to the episode coming out, it was that Kaz was being pressured by a racer named Rucklin to take some dangerous and unstable hyperfuel that is in Yeager's office. Well, that official description is not exactly right. What actually happens in the episode is that Rucklin runs a con basically on Kaz and says, hey, Yeager was a real crazy pilot. We should go see his racer. Can you sneak us in? And there's all sorts of machinations that lead up to making Kaz feel guilty enough to sneak him in. And that's how they end up going into Yeager's private area. They don't get to see his racer, but they do get to a place where this guy Rucklin is able to see where the hyperfuel is and steal it to use in his own racer. So yeah, a little bit different from what the official description said. And of course, things do not go well using the hyperfuel. In fact, the guy nearly dies and Kaz is able to save him at the last minute. So that's your first top takeaway. Your second top takeaway is the fact that this is the appearance of Elijah Wood in Star Wars Resistance as this ne'er-do-well racer Jace Rucklin, who wants to be one of the 5 aces on the platform and unfortunately hasn't beaten one of them to do it, and so his whole plot is to steal this hyperfuel so that way he can power his racer and be able to challenge one of the aces and to be able to take over that coveted spot on the ship. And of course, and it doesn't go well, and he's like, you haven't heard the last of me. And so that in itself is kind of fascinating because, I mean, they bothered to bring Elijah Wood into this thing and were touting him as part of the initial episode launch. So, is it entirely possible that he's just a one and done? I find it hard to believe. I mean, on the one hand, it's Elijah Wood, so we've, had Poe Dameron's Oscar Isaac and Captain Phasma's Gwendolyn Christie show up and only be in one episode, so maybe it's not that strange, but this one seems like, it's a little weird to have him show up and be gone. I'm already wondering when they're going to bring back Donald Faison as Hype Faison, and, he still hasn't shown up. He was referenced in this episode, but he was not actually appearing as a character and as a voice actor, so I don't know. How they deploy the star voice actors, if you will, is rather interesting to me. Now, our third top takeaway is that there's a moment where Jace Rucklin describes his crew as being the best crew this side of the Western Reaches. And there we go again with another geographical mention where we're thinking to ourselves, how does this play out in relation to where this place is and where the First Order is? We still don't know the location of Castellan. We just know it's somewhere in the Outer Rim, but initially, because it was supposed to have some First Order connection, or at least there was supposed to be some First Order connection in the plot, we thought it was going to be closer to the unknown regions, but it's, according to Poe Dameron, more like it's closer to wild space. And the Western Reaches are certainly closer to the unknown regions. So yeah, the mystery of where Castellan, the planet where this is all taking place, the mystery of where that planet is deepening. Now, your fourth top takeaway is more of just a fun little bit. One of the things in the con that Jace runs on Kaz is to race him to a ring on speeder bikes that he happens to have handy. And of course, one of them, the one that Kaz rides, has been jury-rigged to malfunction, so that way, Jace can save his life. But these are speeder bikes that look just like the ones you saw in Return of the Jedi, except they don't have steering vanes on the front of them. And that I thought was a little strange, at least for my own experience, because when I see them without steering vanes, I think of that scene where Luke slices off the steering vanes of one of the speeder bike pilots and the speeder bike, and the thing goes woo 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 and just spins out of control and crashes. And yet Jace and Kaz were able to fly these speeder bikes perfectly straight without steering vanes and without spinning out of control. So I don't know. Maybe the atmosphere is a little bit different on Castellon or something like that. Maybe they've made speeder bike improvements over the last 30 years and they don't necessarily require those steering vanes anymore. Anyway, kind of neat to see speeder bikes regardless and to be brought to mind of that very exciting scene from Return of the Jedi. All right, moving on to our fifth top takeaway. The fact that it's an open secret that Yeager has a hyperfuel stash. What is going on with this platform that nobody can keep a secret if they have something valuable? Kaz blows it with his Erodium trophy that we saw in a previous episode. Now we find out that there is a Corellian hyperfuel stash. That is how it's actually mentioned, Corellian hyperfuel. So that in itself is kind of fascinating that they got the coaxium from Corellia apparently, but anyway, that Yeager has this stash of hyperfuel, and this is apparently a known or rumored and discussed thing. So, yeah, nobody's able to keep secrets about their valuable stuff, and so this is going to be a real messy experience, I think, on the Colossus. I don't think anybody is going to really be surviving for that long without having stuff getting stolen from them, and that certainly turns out to be the case here as well. I don't think Yeager actually gets his hyperfuel back by the end of this episode after all. And then our sixth top takeaway is just a note to say that the action in this was pretty well done, particularly at the end when Kaz realizes what has happened and tries to stop Jace from flying off with a hyperfuel-fueled racer, and jumps onto the canopy and or jumps on top of the ship, opens up the canopy from the outside, and then it gets dropped for the race like we've seen before. And they're actually flying. Kaz is able to stomp the eject button, and they're shooting up into the sky with just on the ejector seat, and unfortunately the parachute's been removed to try to lighten the load on this thing, so they start falling down to the ocean into near death, or to death, certain death, and BB-8 is able to snag him with a cable, and Yeager is able to pull them up with, just hanging off of that cable, and don't know how he didn't rip his hands open. I'm sure BB-8's cable isn't exactly friendly to bare skin, but anyway. Suspension of disbelief. We'll file that one under it, and the fact that BB-8 was able to grab on to two people and an ejector seat and not be pulled off the platform. Yeah, that's pretty impressive, BB-8, so good for you. And the last takeaway from this episode that I'll share is that we get background on Yeager that we didn't have. We knew that he and Poe Dameron had a, some sort of working relationship previously, didn't know what might have been involved in it. And we still don't necessarily know, but we do know that Yeager's background includes working with the rebellion. In fact, he was present at the Battle of Jakku and is a survivor of that particular engagement. And he also apparently had a wife and kid at some point, and we see that in photos in his office. But unfortunately, we haven't seen anything about a wife and kid on the platform anywhere, and the reaction that Kaz has upon seeing this suggests that maybe wife and kid aren't around anymore, and we don't necessarily know yet whether that's because they've left or because they have died or some other calamitous situation. So that is something that is yet to be revealed. But the fact that Yeager was once part of the rebellion and is now saying he doesn't want any part of whatever is going on with Poe Dameron and Kaz and the First Order and the Resistance, well, that in itself suggests that there's probably a bit of a tragic background there, and it probably involves his family too. And that is going to do it for our 7 top takeaways from Fuel for the Fire, which is episode 4 from season 1 of Star Wars Resistance. And I hope you will consider subscribing to the show here, so that way you get the next episode and the next delivered to you automatically without you having to think about it. Our next episode coverage for Resistance will happen a week from today, when the next episode actually airs on the Disney Channel. And I hope you will consider supporting this one-man podcast show daily for 4+ years. It's at patreon.com/SW7x7 if you'd like to put a little something in the tip jar with my thanks and gratitude for it. Thanks and gratitude being the same thing, roughly, but you get the idea. And aside from all that, it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, And may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
This podcast is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2018, Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it!